Good afternoon, everyone. This is Carrie Worthington from the NARUC office. I am a senior manager for NARUC, and I'm also a manager with the National Council on Electricity Policy, which is a project of NARUC. I'm going to do just a few housekeeping remarks. First, I'd like to guide people through connecting to the audio. We do need that audio pin to be able to mute and unmute you throughout the presentation if we need to. But we actually don't anticipate opening up the phones. So if you do have questions throughout the presentation, you can submit them through text, either using the chat box or the questions box. We will be taking questions towards about the last 15 minutes of the presentation of the hour. And if you ever lose one of those chat or questions boxes, you can go to View and then make sure it's checked, and you'll be able to find it at the top of your screen. So welcome. This is a National Council on Electricity Policy webcast. NCEP is a platform for all state-level electricity decision makers to share information and learn from diverse perspectives on evolving electricity issues. Our community includes over 200 representatives from public utility commissions, air and environmental regulatory agencies, governors, staffs, and state energy offices, legislators, and consumer advocates. Like I said, we're an affiliate of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, NARUC, and the department that we're under is the Center for Partnerships and Innovation, led by Danielle Sass-Burnett. NCEP serves as a forum for collaboration around grid-related topics at state, regional, and national levels, offering a unique opportunity for state electricity decision makers throughout the country to examine the ways new technologies, policies, regulations, and market impact state resources in the bulk power system. Today, we're also welcoming all of our community members, all of our stakeholders, as this is a public webinar. Now, I would like to introduce Commissioner Abigail Anthony from the Rhode Island Public Utility Commission. She was appointed by the Governor of Rhode Island in June 2017. Previously from that, she was the director of Acadia's Center for Grid Modernization and Utility Reform Initiative. I should also maybe call her Dr. Anthony because she earned a PhD in Environmental and Natural Resource Economics from the University of Rhode Island. Commissioner Anthony, please take it away.
Great. Thank you, Carrie, and welcome everyone to the webinar this afternoon. I'm really excited to hear from our presenters about their research and experience on the impact of variable renewable energy on wholesale power prices. When Carrie asked me to take part in this webinar, I was reminded of a study that ISO New England released late in 2018, where they had analyzed scenarios or the impact of variable renewable energy resources on wholesale market prices in the New England market during the polar vortex that we experienced last year in 2017, 2018, and that they had found that if the region had an additional 1,600 megawatts of offshore wind, wholesale market prices would have been suppressed by $11 a megawatt hour to about $13 a megawatt hour, saving $80 million in production costs and about 1.8 BCF of natural gas during a cold snap period, which in our region is about a day's worth of gas for the generation fleet. So I'm excited to hear more from Andrew and Keith about their research and experience in this area, as well as understanding how wholesale market price suppression is experienced in different types of markets throughout the country, be it vertically integrated or deregulated like we are in the Northeast. So I'll start by introducing our researchers. First is Andrew Mills. Andrew is a research scientist in the Electricity Markets and Policy Group at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Andrew conducts research on the integration of variable generation into the electric power system, evaluating the costs, benefits, and institutional needs of renewable energy transmission and other supporting infrastructure. Andrew has a PhD in Energy and Resources from UC Berkeley and a BS in Mechanical Engineering from the Illinois Institute of Technology. After Andrew's presentation of his research, we'll hear from Keith Collins from the Southwest Power Pool. Keith is the Executive Director of the Market Monitoring Unit at SPP. Prior to joining the Southwest Power Pool in 2017, Keith was the manager of the Monitoring and Reporting Group within California ISO's Market Monitoring Department, and he worked for the Office of Enforcement at FERC and began his career consulting for the New York Power Pool during its transition to the New York ISO. Keith has a bachelor's degree in economics and government from Bowdoin College and a master of public policy degree from George Mason University. So first we will hear from Andrew, and following that we will go right into Keith, and then we will take questions from the audience. So Andrew, let's take it away.
Great, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to present today. I'll be talking about the recent impacts that we've been seeing of wind and solar on wholesale power prices. This work was conducted by a large team of us here at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab and was funded by a combination of different Department of Energy offices, with the Office of Electricity being the primary funder of this. This slide deck is based on some work that will be released in report form shortly, but it builds on previous work that we did in support of the DOE staff report to Secretary Perry on electricity markets and reliability. That previous work is currently available and can be accessed through our website, and I'll provide a link at the end of my slides here. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. The context of this research is the recent changes that we've been seeing in wholesale prices, which are shown on the figure in the top left there. Also, the composition of the power system, which you can see is changing as we see more gas deployment and less coal in that slide in the figure on the right. And then also we've been seeing a fair amount of retirements that have been occurring, and along with the additions of wind and solar in the bottom left there, along with sort of flattening load growth. And this has also seen changes in the way that the power system's been operated. In particular, you can see some of the changing capacity factors of different generation resources in that bottom right figure. Along with these various changes, there has been some concerns that wind and solar are some of the primary causes of these trends. And the questions that emerge from this discussion are, first, to what degree has wind and solar contributed to these trends? How might those impacts grow in the future? And what effects these might have in terms of changes on various assets, including on deployment of variable energy resources like wind and solar? We don't answer all of these questions directly in this work, but we do aim to contribute to this broader conversation and start to help build that out. Next slide. And again, as I mentioned, this analysis builds on some past work and may hopefully inform a variety of different discussions that are happening in the electricity sector. Some of these discussions focus on planning and investment decisions. And so again, these are things like how trends in annual average wholesale prices may impact inflexible baseload generation assets. Also, the temporal variations in wholesale prices impact the value of flexible resources, including supply, demand, and also storage assets. The importance of the geographic variation in prices is that it helps to inform power plant planning and siting and signaling high and low value locations. The geographic variations in prices also help illustrate the value of transmission expansion and in order to reduce congestion. Aside from these planning and investment decisions, there's also a variety of policy and market design decisions that are influenced, including the degree to which wholesale prices are impacted by policy and might inform policy reform and ISO market design. They might also inform market discussions related to premature retirements of thermal plants, which was sort of a large focus of the DOE staff report. And it might also suggest different changes to market design, especially if reflective of an inability to access the flexibility that exists within the grid. These altered pricing patterns that we're going to be highlighting also impact the market value of wind and solar and can affect the competitiveness of those technologies and inform policies going forward. Next slide. So considerable attention has been placed on the impacts of wind and solar on wholesale power prices. And this is because of the rapid growth in wind and solar, but also because of the unique characteristics that might have distinctive impacts on these pricing patterns. This literature that is summarized here in the figure consistently confirms that the addition of wind and solar with low marginal costs tends to lead to lower market clearing prices. This list of literature, if you see in sort of one of the far right column, shows that there's a variety of different estimates of the magnitude of the effect. And these vary in part due to different approaches that are being used, they're being applied to different regions. And this makes somewhat comparisons across some of these different studies difficult. But that's one of the things that we're going to try to do here is to be able to apply a single consistent methodology across all of these different regions. And we're also going to expand on this literature by taking the impacts of wind and solar and trying to put those into the context of many of the other possible drivers of wholesale prices that have changed over this time period. Next slide. So we build on this past literature by trying to empirically estimate the degree to which growth in wind and solar has influenced wholesale prices in the United States. Here we're just focusing on energy prices, and so we're not talking about capacity and ancillary service prices in this work. We're primarily focusing on the period from 2008 to 2017. And again, as I mentioned, as where possible, we try to assess the other drivers of these observed trends. So more specifically, what we do is that we assess the impact of wind and solar on annual average, market-wide average historical wholesale prices. We conduct this analysis for all 7 centrally organized wholesale markets in the US, and we apply a relatively simple fundamental supply curve model. And so in contrast to much of the previous literature, our approach allows for this application of a consistent method across multiple regions and enables us to compare the influence of wind and solar to many other factors. For this analysis, we use this simple supply curve to be able to replicate market prices, and how well we're able to replicate actual market prices is shown by comparing the actual prices in some of the market hubs, which are represented in this figure by the small black dots, to the modeled prices from our model in the same year, and that's what's represented by the blue bars. And you can see that the blue bar on the left is 2008, the blue bar on the right is 2017. And what we do is that we then change one factor at a time between a base year and a change year to understand how changes in that one factor have impacted average wholesale prices. And that's what is shown by these individual green and red bars in between. And again, we show here the contribution of all these different factors to their changes in wholesale prices between 2008 and 2017. And in this figure, we're just showing our results for CalISO and ERCOT. And for these two markets, you can see that natural gas is by far the biggest contributor to the changes in wholesale prices. You can see that there's an impact of wind and solar also, but those are somewhat secondary relative to the natural gas impacts. Go to the next slide, please. We conduct the same analysis for each of these centrally organized wholesale markets in the US. And so here now, each little dot is representing the change in prices from over 2008 to 2017 from changes in that particular factor for each ISO. And the gray bars represent the range of impacts across all of the ISOs. And we see here that wind and solar have contributed to reductions in overall average wholesale prices since 2008, but that, again, natural gas prices have had the largest impact on average prices over this period. Across all 7 centrally organized wholesale markets, we see that it's natural gas in this period. And the place where we see that happening the most is in places where we have a lot of natural gas on the margin. So places like CalISO and ERCOT, where we have a lot of natural gas, we see larger impacts. Whereas places like SPP and MISO, where you also have a lot of coal that can sometimes be on the margin, we see somewhat of a less impact of natural gas on average wholesale prices. The impact of wind and solar has been secondary compared to this impact of natural gas, but it is among the biggest drivers in this sort of second tier of factors with similar magnitudes of impact that also includes the expansion and retirement of other generation capacity, to changes in demand, to changes in generator efficiency, represented here by the heat rate, changes in coal prices, and also variations in hydropower from year to year, and in some areas, changes in emission prices. Next slide. The magnitude of the estimated impact of wind and solar on average wholesale prices primarily depends on the incremental level of wind and solar penetration. So we see where we have more wind or solar leads to a greater impact on prices, as shown in this figure. In most of the markets, the total impact that we saw on average prices in 2017 was below about $1.3 per megawatt hour. The one exception to this is California, where we see that solar growth is estimated to have reduced prices by more like $2.50 per megawatt hour, perhaps foreshadowing greater impacts from solar in other regions as the penetration of solar grows. The impact of wind and solar on average wholesale prices that we're reporting here is within the range, but often on the lower end of those estimates that I showed in the previous table from some of the previous literature. In some cases, this can be due to methodological differences. A lot of the previous work was based on more regression models, but it also can be due to things like the period that we're covering and what is the choice of the base year. So there's a wide variety of factors that can impact these assessments. Next slide. So one of the things in the earlier analysis that we conducted, and we haven't actually updated this in this current work, was just to look at patterns of where retirements have occurred in the US and compare that to where we've seen deployment of wind and solar. If we saw high correlation of wind and solar with retirements, we would expect to see a pattern of dots that were increasing up to the right. And instead, we see that there are some regions with a high amount of retirements, even though they have low amounts of wind and solar. And there are some regions with high amounts of wind and solar that have low shares of retirements. So this just suggests that to date, the factors that have been driving retirements are other than VRE in many of these different regions. And so this conclusion is supported by our finding that while VRE is having an impact on average prices, it's somewhat secondary to some of these other factors and comparable to a range of things other than natural gas. Okay, next slide. So that sort of concludes this work where we're just looking at the impacts to average wholesale prices. And here we'll start to look at the fact that average wholesale prices are just one part of the story, and that the impact of wind and solar on wholesale power markets also has to do with the impact that they have to the temporal and geographic variation in prices. So to do this, we looked went beyond just looking at the average wholesale prices and started to look at individual pricing nodes all across the United States. And here you can see the average prices across all of the nodes that we have. It's about 60,000 or so just in 2017. And you can see that there's a pretty wide variation from node to node. And then we're going to start to kind of dive into these individual pricing nodes to explain and unpack some of the variation that we're seeing here. Next slide. So one of the first things that we noticed when we started to dive into this is that we see that negative prices are on the rise. That in 2017, we saw that about 34% of pricing nodes across the country experienced negative real-time prices that occurred in more than about 5% or that occurred in 5% or more hours. So 34% of pricing nodes have negative prices in 5% or more hours. And that was in 2017. We do see that negative prices are starting to increase in day-ahead markets too, though they remain much less common than we see in the real-time market. These negative prices were very frequent in California, and we can see that they're spilling out to other parts of the West. They're also very pervasive across the wind-rich regions of the Southwest Power Pool and parts of MISO. And they're starting to grow across portions of Texas. And they're also seeing that there's parts of them occurring in New York, Maine, and New Hampshire. Carrie, if you could click forward, I might have some animations. Yeah, go ahead and click 2 more times, please. There we go, thank you. So if you could go back 1, there you go. So we see here that those places where we're seeing growth in negative prices also happen to be areas where we are seeing growth in wind and solar. And in California, for example, most nodes experience negative LMPs in at least 6% of all of the hours of the year. And we do expect that wind and solar were contributors to these trends. One of the other things that's interesting is that the negative prices in California seem to be largely system-wide events where we're seeing negative prices sort of across the whole ISO footprint occurring relatively at the same time. Whereas in other cases, particularly up in the northeastern region and in parts of SPP, we don't necessarily see these all happening at the same time. Instead, they're sort of more localized. And that means that in contrast to California, these other regions, some of these negative prices might be able to be addressed a little bit more easily through enhanced transmission infrastructure. But if you have sort of negative prices occurring everywhere at the same place, transmission less likely to be a solution for those sort of issues that we're seeing. Go ahead and go to the next slide now, please. So we also look at a few hotspots where we see this increase in negative prices to determine if it is wind and solar that are really the driving factor. So this is one of the hotspots that we looked at, which is in the Oklahoma region of the Southwest Power Pool. And one of the things that we see is that prices do tend to be lower when the wind is blowing, even given the same load levels. That's what's shown in that figure in the top left, is that we've sort of parsed out what the prices look like at times when wind is at different levels and at times when demand is at different levels. And so the sort of darker blues there indicate that the lowest prices happen when you have both lots of wind and low load. We also see similar sort of effect with negative prices, where we're seeing more and more negative prices occurring at times when the wind is blowing, even given the same load levels. And then this figure on the right-hand side shows that what sort of the average generation levels are of different generating resources within the SPP region during times of when the prices are negative on the right-hand side, and then during times when the prices are positive. And so you can see that the wind tends to be generating more during those times of negative prices, and that other generation like coal and gas and hydro are somewhat responsive to those negative prices in the sense that you see their generation is somewhat lower during those times of negative prices. Not all of the generators are completely backing down. There's still a lot of thermal generation that occurs during those times, and that might have to do with how much those different generators are actually exposed to these negative prices. Next slide, please. We go ahead and do the same sort of analysis to look at the effect of solar on pricing patterns in California, and this is where it really stands out. And so what we did was we compared the average pricing patterns in 2011 to more recent year in 2017. And you can see that solar is starting to impact and shift the time of day profile and wholesale prices such that they're lower in the middle of the day and starting to become higher in the early evening. And you see that lower prices in the middle of the day, particularly occurring in the spring months. And while overall prices didn't really change on average between 2011 and 2017, the average prices were about the same. We do see that the midday prices are about $30 per megawatt hour lower in 2017 than they were for the same hours in 2011. And then also we see an interesting spike that occurs in 2017 where prices were $40 per megawatt hour greater during sometimes in the summer evenings than they were for the same hours in 2011. These higher prices that we're seeing in the summer evenings are from a set of very high priced hours that occurred when the load was quite high, higher than it was in 2011, and we had less nuclear generation available in 2017 than 2011 due to some retirements. We also saw that there was significant ramping that was occurring at these times because the solar was ramping down as the sun went down. And so at the same time, you have high load and high ramps, and we started to see some of those price spikes occurring then. Just having the high ramps alone wasn't necessarily sufficient to cause these price spikes, which we saw high ramps in other seasons, but you didn't see as much of the price spike. But if you have that combination of high load and high ramps, we saw some high prices there. We can also look at the negative prices on the bottom, and we see that with more and more solar, we see that the negative prices are starting to occur in the middle of the day, whereas in 2011, there were actually quite a bit of negative pricing that was happening then prior to solar really building out in California. But the negative prices happened to occur more in the evening during the middle of the night in the spring and the summer periods. Next slide, please. So here we kind of unpack a little bit more of what is going on in California in terms of, again, looking at what different generators were doing during those times of negative prices. And we can see that on the left-hand side, again, the rapid growth in solar deployment in California really has only picked up since about 2012 or so. And that period of high negative prices that occurred in 2011 was sort of previous to this rapid growth period. And those negative prices actually exceeded what we've seen in more recent years. And again, we saw negative prices both in the real-time market and in the day-ahead market occurring. So we went ahead and looked at trying to understand what might have been contributing to these negative prices. And we see that it's not just a wind and solar story, but that there are cases where what's going on with the other generator can be kind of an important part of the story. So some of the things that we see going on in 2011 that contributed to the negative prices is that we in 2011 had quite a bit of hydro. It was a high hydro year, which is also similar to 2017, but the middle years of 2012 and 2015 had quite a bit less hydro and less negative prices during those times. 2011 also had a lot more nuclear generation. Some of that was retired as the Songs generator was shut down after 2011. And then we also see that there's quite a bit of thermal generation in 2011 that wasn't really responding much to negative prices. That the gray bars, which represent, I'm sorry, the brown bars, which represent the thermal, were somewhat responsive, but there's still quite a bit of thermal that's online. And then the imports, which are the gray bars, are not very responsive to the negative prices. And if you shift forward to 2017, one of the big changes that we see here is that even though we had a lot of hydro, we have less of the nuclear generation, and we see a lot more responsiveness in the thermal generation and a lot more responsiveness in the imports. That the imports are backing down quite a bit during times of negative prices. And then again, but now what's contributing to that is that we see a lot of solar during those negative price events. So again, the main takeaway from this is just that, that really understanding what's driving negative prices can be complicated in some regions, and there's a lot of interactions that can occur between different resources. Next slide, please. Again, one other thing that's important here to think about is when we do see negative prices, that there are cases where the impacts, the frequency of negative prices can be mitigated in large part by transmission expansion. And a real clear example of this is the CREZ transmission investments that occurred in Texas. One of the things that we saw prior to that deployment in 2011 was that there was quite a bit of congestion and frequent negative prices occurring more in the West Texas part of ERCOT. And then as that transmission was fully deployed out towards 2013, that negative price frequency really declined in 2014, and you see a lot less of that congestion. Going forward, if you look again back at that 2017 slide, we're starting to see more of negative prices starting to occur. So it's not necessarily eliminating all of it, but that has to do with wind starting to pick up and grow again. So there's sort of a balance there between how much transmission makes sense and how much negative prices are sort of acceptable. Next slide. I just have a couple of things here before I wrap up, which is that one of the things we were interested in trying to understand is that we saw pretty widespread negative prices, but we just really talked about the frequency of those. And another metric that we can use is to think about how much those negative prices are actually pulling down the average annual wholesale prices. So this metric here shows the same map for 2017. I'm sorry, I didn't have the year here labeled, but this is 2017, and it shows the impact of negative prices on average wholesale prices. And you can see that the place where it stands out the most is in the SPP region, where there's a lot of wind deployment. And then also you can see that up in the northern parts of ISO New England and northern New York, where the negative prices that are occurring there are having pretty substantial impacts on average prices. There's some places in California where you also see some hot spots like that, and in some of the energy imbalance markets in Wyoming. Next slide. So one of the things that we asked was, because these negative prices aren't necessarily impacting average wholesale prices everywhere, but it's sort of more limited in where it's occurring, is to try to understand which generators might be impacted most by these negative prices. And we do this in two ways. We look at the percent reduction in average wholesale prices due to the negative prices, and we do that at different nodes, and then we sort of capacity weight that by the amount of capacity that's associated with that node. And so what we see in the figure on the left is that the green line shows that the generation that's at nodes where you see negative prices, the most is wind. So wind is having the biggest impact, or is impacted the most by negative prices, whereas other thermal generation like coal, nuclear, and gas are somewhat less impacted by those negative prices, though you can see a trend over time where that's starting to increase. And then we just look at the absolute magnitude in the figure on the right, just from 2017, and you can see that there are some places where generation is more impacted by it, but again, on a capacity-weighted average basis, it seems to be wind is primarily the resource that's impacted the most, and we see hydro and solar are sort of next in line after that. Next slide. And so this is a final conclusion slide here. So we did want to emphasize that this decrease in market-wide average wholesale prices that we saw since 2008 could largely be attributed to the change in natural gas prices over that time period. The historical impact of wind and solar is somewhat limited, and that's in part due to the fact that when you have lower natural gas prices, the supply curve becomes fairly flat. But what we do see is, over this same time period, we do see pretty dramatic impacts of wind and solar on these temporal and geographic patterns. And we see that there's this frequency of negative wholesale prices, which is on the rise, and that we can attribute parts of that to wind and solar. And with wind, you can often see that that's sometimes driven by these transmission constraints. And that negative prices is impacting wind and solar assets much more than other generation assets so far, but you can start to see some of these spillover impacts that are occurring and starting to increase in other places. And the magnitude and importance of these shifts in the longer term depends on whether other sort of disruptions occur, including efforts to actively mitigate the grid effects of wind and solar. And next slide. I'll just leave it here with my contact information if you're interested in reaching out directly. And then also this link here can provide a link to all of our renewable energy research, including the previous work that we had done that was released in 2017, looking at some of these same impacts of wind and solar on average wholesale market prices. With that, I'll look forward to hearing first from Keith and then addressing some of your questions.
Thank you, Andrew. That was terrific. Carrie, can we get Keith's presentation queued up, and we'll move right into that.
All right, thank you. This is Keith Collins. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today on negative prices and our experience in SPP. I think Andrew's presentation did a good job highlighting a lot of the cross-market views, looking at some of the factors. And I think what I'll be able to do for you today is to provide a sort of a deep dive in a particular market. And when you do look at some of the slides that Andrew was presenting, many of the prices, particularly in the SPP region, which encompasses sort of the middle part of the U.S. from North Dakota down to North Texas, there were a significant increase in negative prices, particularly in the more recent period of 2017. My presentation will dive into that. We'll provide some statistics, some causes, and some potential takeaways from that as part of the presentation. All right, so next slide, please. All right, so just to give folks a sense of the SPP region for folks that are not familiar with the Southwest Power Pool, we do have over 20,000 megawatts of wind on the system. This is among the highest. I know ERCOT has a little bit more, but as we see here, particularly in terms of penetration, 64% wind, 69% renewable, which includes hydro and some solar as well. We reached these levels in the spring of last year. It is not, I think we do see it above 50%, at least during some parts of the year, fairly regularly, at least for some time of the year. As you can see, total wind generation over 16,000 megawatts. And to give you a sense relative to load, we peak at about a little over 50,000. It's also important to note that renewable generation typically offers in the market at negative prices. This is primarily because of either tax incentives that they receive or other incentives they may receive both at the federal and state level. So they do have negative marginal offers into both the day-ahead and real-time markets. And one of the things to note here before we get started is the frequency of negative prices in SPP's real-time markets in 2017 was 7%. So 7% of all intervals in the total year were negative, and we'll get to that in the presentation. So next slide, please. So just to give you a sense of growth in both wind capacity and generation, capacity is represented by the bars, generation is denoted within the line, is that much of the growth in the wind capacity has been, we've seen a doubling over the last 5 years. So when you look back in the 2014 time period, we were a little around 8.5 gigawatts of wind, and that has increased to over 20 gigawatts of wind capacity in 2018. So there has been a significant shift, and one of the things we'll note in some of the subsequent slides is there tends to be a tipping point, and I think that's that sort of comes out as part of Andrew's presentation is that I think he identified that natural gas was a primary driver, but I think what we're seeing and experiencing in SPP is that once you hit a certain point of penetration, it's going to have a much larger and more significant impact on pricing, and we have experienced that here in SPP. So next slide, please. Just to give a sense of other generation, I do show compare wind to both the coal. Coal is the top line in gray. You'll see that's been coming down. It's down to about 43% of total generation in SPP in 2018. Wind capacity is around 24%, and then you have some gas and nuclear below. But you'll see as a single source, wind is a significant contributor of generation, and we see the displacement of coal in particular as a result of that. Next slide. This slide, what we're doing is we're looking at what is the fuel type of the resource that is price setting in the SPP market. And so we have a range of data going back to 2007. And what you'll see in green is that wind is represented in green, and we didn't really see significant impacts of wind on real-time prices until 2013 and particularly 2014, over the last 5 years. And so as I noted in terms of capacity additions, it's really there's a certain level when the penetration starts having more impact on pricing. And we see that here in SPP at about the 2014 period in particular is the SPP market prices are being affected by the higher penetration of renewable generation. And that's just increased steadily over the last several years. And it's primarily displacing coal generation on the margin as opposed to the gas. All right, next slide. This is a view of both quarterly, you'll see on the left, and then annually on the right, of the frequency of negative pricing in SPP markets. You'll see that it's actually not the spring. The second quarter is typically not the period with the highest negative pricing. We'll see in 2017 it was actually in the fall, and then in 2018 it was actually in the first quarter. So it definitely it depends on the time of year, but it typically correlates with lower loads. As you'll see in Q3, it tends to be the lowest. Again, that has to do with load levels are lower. And then you'll see here that there is a bit of a pattern here, 2016, 2017, 2018. We peaked in 2017 in terms of negative pricing. One of the things that led to the decline in 2018, the primary factor was transmission expansion. There was a significant transmission bottleneck that was alleviated by a transmission upgrade in 2018 that dramatically, as you can see, it more than halved the frequency of negative pricing in the SPP footprint in the year. So the other thing I'll note too is that the bars are broken up to represent the magnitude of the negative pricing. We'll see that most of it is between $0 and minus $25, but we do see some above that. And one of the things that we've identified is that in some cases there is some wind, and actually a significant amount of wind that is non-dispatchable by the RTO and the market. And so they do not provide a price, they are must take. And what can happen is because they cannot be dispatched, that can increase the magnitude of the negative prices that we're seeing. And so they do play a role in what's happening, particularly if it's non-dispatchable. All right, next slide. In terms of the profile of negative pricing, what we see here is that in the SPP system, as opposed to the Cal ISO system, which is more of a solar system, the off-peak hours, particularly the early morning hours, 2, 3 in the morning or so, is where we tend to see the highest concentration and frequency of negative pricing, and that's been true in the 3 years that we're representing here, and before that as well. I think it's also interesting to note that even so, in some of the sort of afternoon hours, there is a frequency. You'll see in the 2018 and 2016 periods, it's about 2.5% in some of the hours, but it does occur at all times of the day. But most noticeably, you can see over 15% of the intervals in the early morning hours were in fact negative back in 2017. So next slide, please. One of the things that is important to note, and I think Andrew mentioned it in his presentation, is that we've been focused primarily in discussing sort of the real-time spot market prices, but the question is, well, what about day-ahead market prices? Do they reflect the same frequency of negative prices? And the answer is, the pattern is similar, but the frequency is less. And what you'll see here is that again, the pattern being that 2017, there was about 3.5% of prices in the day-ahead markets in SPP were negative, but that did come down in 2018 as a result of the transmission expansion, and it was actually less than 1%, but about, I think it was around 0.5%. So it's less, but again, the pattern still seems to hold in terms of when they're occurring. They tend to follow a similar pattern overall relative to the real time, but the magnitude in terms of frequency is less. And there's a reason for that. And if we go to the next slide, we'll get into one of the reasons why this happens. And it has to do with a particular pattern that occurs in the Southwest Power Pool markets. And in particular, what we're showing in this slide is the difference between the supply in real time versus the supply in the day-ahead market. And so when we have a column that says additional energy, this is energy that was not in the day-ahead market that is in the real-time market. And you'll see that the primary factor is wind. And so, and this is for 2018. And so you'll see here that it's about 1,100 megawatts of wind that is not scheduled in the day-ahead market materializes in the real-time market. And this is on average for every hour. So it's the average of all hours in 2018. And there are some other factors, for instance, increase in imports. There can be self-committed generation by participants that were not committed by the day-ahead market. And so those are factors, but the primary factor is in the wind. I think there is a sense that markets will work, particularly in the RTO markets that are FERC jurisdictional. You have virtual bids and offers that are designed to converge prices, and so the thought here is that they would come in and they would provide convergence of the market. But what you'll see here is that, in fact, the amount of virtual supply that is working to converge it is what's represented in what we call reductions, and that's only about it's a little less than 500 megawatts per hour. And so what you'll see here is that the additional energy vastly outweighs any reductions between the day-ahead and real-time. And so the simple economic argument is that you have more supply in real-time, which causes real-time prices to be lower than day-ahead prices. And at times, we've seen up to 4,000 or 5,000 megawatts of additional real-time wind materialize, and that can collapse the prices that we're seeing, and that adds to some of the frequency of negative prices. So next slide. The other point that I wanted to make is that congestion plays a significant factor in the frequency of negative prices. And so we've listed here all the different participants, and they're mostly load-serving entities represented here. And so you have some participants that are experiencing negative pricing, or in one case, over 20% of the time. Whereas you have other participants on the other end that's more like 2% of the time. And so congestion, depending on where you are on the system relative to the constraint, can have a significant impact on whether or not you experience a high level of negative prices within your system or at your nodes. This is 2017. If we go to the next slide will show us what the results are in 2018, and you'll see that it's the scale has not changed, the scale is the same, and so congestion still plays a role, but we see it's dramatically less. And as I noted earlier, is that there was some key transmission expansions, particularly at the location that was causing a lot of the bottleneck, that significantly alleviated that. And so it's dramatically reduced the frequency that we see of negative prices throughout the system, and what individuals are experiencing as well. So a good instance of key transmission having a significant market impact. All right, next slide. And so the key takeaways in my presentation here today is that the negative prices have increased as wind generation has increased. But again, that's important that there's a tipping point to that it took to get to a certain point, and then the frequency increased and has increased as we've had more wind on the system. Dispatchability of variable energy resources can influence the magnitude of negative prices on the system. The scheduling of variable energy resources between day ahead and real time, or the under-scheduling thereof of variable energy resources can affect the frequency of negative prices. And then finally, the importance of the transmission system and upgrades of the system in affecting negative pricing. And to the extent there are bottlenecks, if those are alleviated, we can have significant changes on the system when those upgrades occur. So that is my presentation for you today, and I definitely look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you, Keith. I'm going to start with a question where you ended on the transmission expansions. While we wait for questions from the audience to come in via the chat element in the GoToWebinar system. Both Andrew and Keith's presentations point out that transmission expansion can reduce the incidence of negative prices. But what was the justification for the build out of transmission, for example, Keith, that SPP saw in 2017, 2018? What was the justification for that in the first place? Was it predicated on decreasing the frequency of negative prices, or for some other reason?
It was not the negative prices were not considered at the time of the study that was done. The study did, however, identify the flow impacts of the bottlenecks within the transmission system, but it did not look at the pricing of the potential for negative pricing. And what's interesting is that in the SPP planning processes, they are very conservative in the wind that they anticipate, which is, and by conservative, I mean they've underrepresented the wind in their transmission studies historically. And so more wind tends to come onto the system. And so in doing so, it did not anticipate the level of renewables, and it did not anticipate the impacts on prices. However, the transmission study did do an effective job of identifying the particular bottleneck. And actually that is what is actually key, I think, in the SPP experience, was the specific location was the key location that was driving a lot of the congestion. And they were able to identify that even with the limitations of their studies.
And is that the same experience in California, Andrew, or is there different dynamics happening?
Yeah, well, in the example of the CREZ one that I did, that's actually a Texas example. And in that case, it was, I think, similar to what Keith mentioned. It wasn't necessarily negative prices that were driving that discussion at all, but there was a lot of curtailment that was happening of wind behind some of those transmission congestion points. And negative prices can kind of be a sign that you can see that there's a lot of congestion happening there, but that isn't necessarily what was driving the decision at all. So it sort of is a secondary thing that comes out of it. Instead, what it was really focusing on that congestion and the curtailment that was occurring for wind.
Great. I'm going to move to some questions from the audience. We have a question from Oklahoma. I think this is probably for Keith, but what is the current capacity credit for wind in SPP, and are there any plans to increase that going forward?
So that is an excellent question. I was looking at it just this morning. The current capacity credit for wind is 20%. The market monitoring unit has done a study that identified that that may be a little too low for wind. And by our estimate, about 24% is something that would probably be more accurate based on some historic data that we've looked at. I know there is a sense that the that wind does not actually occur at times when loads are highest, and that is not entirely true. What we found is that over the last couple of years, in particular this last year in 2018, wind was at about 30+% capacity factor on the highest load hour of the year. And so I think we've recommended and will continue to recommend a revisiting of that number of 20%.
Great. Keith, we have another one for you from ISO New England. Were there market rules or market design elements that also changed in the 2013 or 2014 timeframe? I don't know if we want to flip back to one of your slides while you go through that.
So in the 2013-2014, there was the SPP market has been evolving over the last several years, but I believe there was not any. There was. I'm just thinking about back to the slide that I had. There was a change in how the introduction of a day-ahead market, and in addition to the real-time market. So SPP was a real-time market only for a long time, and then switched over to a day-ahead market. And I don't have the precise year that it happened, but I'll see on the slide where I think I had the marginal units. You'll see we had one methodology for counting marginal units, and then a second methodology. That was about the time of the switch over from sort of a day-ahead real-time from a real-time only market.
Great. It looks like we have another question for Keith from Energy Innovation. It's a long one, so I think I'm just going to read it to make sure I don't miss anything. But Keith talks about wind being a must-take resource in SPP. Are there other must-take resources in the market that may also be contributing to negative prices? For example, are there other power plants that cannot be operated flexibly? In addition to having wind and other variable renewable energy offer prices into the market, would it also help to ensure that all power plants in the region offer prices into the market to ensure the least cost portfolio is dispatched in each interval?
So yeah, that is an excellent question. I think hydro is another one, and another one is typically the nuclear. We have not been a proponent of making nuclear flexible, but most other resources tend to have some range, with the exception of the hydro and the nuclear. I will note that there is a current filing before FERC where, based on a recommendation made by the market monitor, we recommended that all variable resources become dispatchable to the market, and a version of that was passed SPP last year and has been filed with FERC. I believe they received a deficiency letter on the filing, and it's being worked on currently. But more generally, we do have a recommendation as the market monitor that all resources that can participate economically in the market should. And one of the problems that we've identified is that there's a fair amount of self-commitment, not necessarily self-scheduling. And the difference between the two is self-commitment is my unit is not, the market doesn't select my unit, so I just am going to run or regardless, versus a self-commitment, which is I also pick a particular output. We find that in most cases, resources are, they'll follow a dispatch signal, but from a commitment perspective, there is still a fair amount of self-commitment within the SPP markets. And so we do have a recommendation that we've made to reduce the frequency and instance of that to help improve price formation. So we are in agreement with the question that more can be done to increase the price formation within SPP.
This is is a question maybe more for Andrew, but how do the impacts of wind on wholesale prices differ from the impacts of solar on wholesale prices? And is there a comparison that can be made between California and SPP with respect to those different resources?
Yeah, I think the things that we saw were primarily around this timing issue, that the impacts of solar on prices were occurring primarily during the day and were very concentrated. And again, because they're happening all at the same time, that means that when we saw impacts from solar on prices, that was pretty widespread, and it occurred sort of across the entire California ISO footprint. Whereas when we were starting to look into cases with wind, you would see more there that you would have just sort of a lot of variation in prices. You might see things where you would have events like springtime events in California, and I think as Keith mentioned, that you might have different seasons in SPP where you see a lot of that, but it wouldn't necessarily happen as widespread at every location at once. And so in those cases, that's where transmission might actually be effective in helping to sort of link up those different regions that have a lot of wind versus places that have less of it, whereas in California, it sort of was happening everywhere. That was the main part. The other part that we saw was with these average price effects over the entire year. One of the reasons why it appeared that solar was having a larger impact on the average wholesale prices for its penetration level than wind was because the solar in that case was actually lined up well with the time when the supply curve was pretty steep, right? So if there's a lot of load and solar's coming on during those times, the supply curve can be pretty steep, and you can, by having more solar come online, you can depress prices more during those times than you would if generation was occurring during times when the supply curve was fairly flat. And so that's one of the factors that we saw really drove the differences in the average wholesale price impacts between wind and solar in our analysis.
And what do those price impacts of wind and solar suggest for market incentives to invest more in those resources, and I guess to invest in different forms of storage?
This is another one where, again, because of sort of the impacts of solar tending to occur at the same time, that meant that the prices are indicating that the value of incremental more solar being built on top of that can tend to decrease fairly rapidly. So we're seeing that in wholesale prices. The incentive to invest in solar is somewhat diminishing as more solar is being added, and we see that effect in some of the California cases, whereas you do see some of that occurring with wind, but again, maybe because it's not as concentrated, it's a little bit less dramatic so far from what we've seen. And in terms of the incentives for flexible resources like storage, you could imagine that if you think about storage as providing something like arbitrage, that frequent negative prices and then frequent price spikes are something that storage would find an economic opportunity for. And so price spreads like that incentivize more flexible resources like storage to be built. But other resources that can take advantage of high price spikes quickly, like a reciprocating engine, and then be turned off during times with negative prices, might also be incentivized. Whereas an asset that is sort of has to generate at the same output in all hours is going to be generating during those negative price times and the positive price ones. So it's sort of impacted more by the average price there and is not able to take advantage of those that sort of signals for flexibility.
And Keith, do you see that type of response to your wide price spreads happening in SPP with investments in flexible resources or storage?
There's definitely some discussions on investments in storage. I think there are some concerns that the economics are not yet favorable in those circumstances. And I think what can be very challenging in the SPP region is, the market entry and exit that we're seeing is there's sort of the market entry is primarily wind, and if you look at the queue, and the exit is effectively very limited at this time. And so it does allow for the pressures that would be favorable for storage, but while we've seen some interest in the generation interconnection queue increase, there is some concern that the economics may not yet be favorable, even with these price spreads that we're seeing.
Great. Well, we will end right on time. Thank you very much to Andrew and Keith for sharing their research and experience with us today, and to the audience for good questions and participation. Well, thank you, Carrie, and we'll be signing off.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.